my name is Chelsi Abbott. I am a plant pathologist with the Davey Institute, and today I am talking about Unit 8, Tree Problems and Diagnosis. The diagnostic process is a methodical process that we can move through in order to figure out what's going wrong with our trees. If we remember the steps, it goes plant ID, symptoms, patterns of symptoms, and then signs. Or if you help you to remember, it's pss, pss, like you're calling a cat. It's important that we follow the steps of diagnosis every single time in order to ensure we're not going to miss anything and potentially misdiagnose the situation. The first step of diagnosis is the most important, and it's plant ID. Mostly you need to know the plant that you're diagnosing because you need to know how it's supposed to look. If you're unsure what you're looking at, how will you know if it has a problem? For example, something like a sweet bay magnolia, if you don't know that it creates dew in the morning, you might think that it's honeydew. So once you've moved on from the first step, which is plant ID, you know what you're looking at, you know it's abnormal, it's time to move to the next step of diagnosis. And if you remember, that's symptoms. Now recall, symptoms are reactions of plants to problems caused by pests and pathogens. And they can be anything from a fully brown or necrotic leaf to something like leaf blotches or leaf spots, or even cankers, which are essentially wounds. These are all plants' reactions to causal agents causing problems. So now that you've determined the plant ID and cataloged all of the symptoms that you see on that plant, it's time to move to the next step in plant diagnosis, which is patterns of the symptoms. Identifying the patterns of symptoms is a critical step in the diagnostic process because it's often a fork in the road between diagnosing an abiotic or non-living environmental condition and a biotic or living condition such as something caused by insects or pathogens. There are some major patterns that you can start to notice within the environment that can help you with your diagnosis. The first major pattern is a uniform or regular pattern that can be seen throughout a canopy or even throughout a space, that being more than one tree. If you look at the tree behind me, you will notice that a lot of the symptoms seem to be all over in the internal parts of the canopy. This is likely caused by something like frost, which leads us to more an abiotic diagnosis. Oftentimes, abiotic issues show up uniformly within the landscape because there's one and done events. They happen to everything at once, and then they don't progress and get worse throughout the season. Contrast a uniform pattern within the landscape or the canopy with something that's more irregular or random. For example, just one branch at the top or the bottom of the tree, or random species throughout the landscape. This is generally going to be caused by more of a biotic or living thing like insects or diseases, since they typically have a preferred host range and sort of just make damage where they land. Another important pattern to start to identify within the canopies of the trees are top-down or bottom-up damage as it moves throughout the canopy. A bottom-up pattern, or when you can see the symptoms are worse at the bottom of the tree and moving upwards, generally will notify us that this is probably a foliar fungal pathogen. It's a very key pattern for that. If we had a top-down pattern, meaning the damage starts at the top or the tips of the branches and moves downwards throughout the canopy, this usually denotes a vascular disruption. And that's a bit unhelpful because many things can cause vascular disruptions like root rots, girdling roots, drought, and cankers. But at least you know that something's limiting the water transport throughout the tree. So now that we've gone through the steps of diagnosis, we are at the final step, but I'll remind you what we've already learned. We've done plant ID, we've cataloged our symptoms, and we've looked at the patterns of that symptoms. And now we're at our last S in the acronym, signs. Signs is the last step of diagnosis for a reason. It is a confirmation of the causal agent that caused the symptoms that you found earlier. Think about it this way. It's like if a toddler had a crayon and was drawing on the wall, the toddler is the sign. You found the culprit, it's the one doing the damage. A tool that I highly recommend in order to look for signs in the field is a hand lens or a jeweler's loupe. Why I recommend this is that oftentimes signs are microscopic or very, very tiny, and you can't see them with your naked eye. A lot of the times, diagnostic labs will look for signs using things like microscopes, but this is sort of the best thing that we can carry around out in the field. One alternative to a traditional jeweler's loupe or hand lens that I'd like to suggest is one that goes on your phone. Now, I prefer this one, and it's kind of a handy device to have to look for signs that are microscopic while you're trying to show a client, because now your phone becomes the hand lens. So just remember, symptoms are a plant's reaction to a causal agent, where the sign itself is the causal agent causing the symptoms. So I've got a couple signs in my hand here just to sort of help demonstrate this fact. So right here we have a fungal fruiting structure with some spores. The plant didn't make these, and these are the actual sign of the fungi attacking the plant. With insects, it's a little bit easier because oftentimes you don't need a hand lens or a microscope to see the signs, but just think it's the insect itself, or it's the cocoon or exit hole, something that the insect left behind that the plant didn't make. So that's plant problem diagnosis. I'll remind you of the steps. We have plant ID, symptoms, patterns of symptoms, and then lastly, signs, or like you're calling a cat. One of the other things I will mention as a useful tool, especially if you're just starting out with diagnosis, is when you know your host, you can do some research to find out what insects and diseases can appear on that host. One of the things I would recommend is getting used to your growing degree days chart. Now, growing degree days are a map of accumulated heat based upon maximum temperatures and minimum temperatures daily. Using growing degree days can help you know what insects are hatching in order to know when they would be appearing and causing damage on your trees. Thank you for watching. Hopefully that was informative, and happy diagnosing.